So thank you everyone for joining us for our session. This is a fireside chat to discuss implementing FDC3 from a vendor's strategic point of view, shifting to adopting open source for scale and for integrations. I'm Vickey Sanders. I'm Chief Digital Officer at HERE, formerly OpenFin. And I'm joined to my left by Aaron Haines, who's Desktop UI Lead Architect, and also Yatin Thakker, who's Head of Customer Workflows for Workspace, both from LSEG. LSEG is a long-standing customer of HERE's, and we're thrilled to have you both on stage, so thank you for joining us. At HERE, we've had a front row seat to how FDC3 is evolving since we helped to establish the standard with clients way back in 2017, as you heard from Rob on stage earlier this morning. What we've learned from a large community of sell-side firms, of buy-side firms, and also vendors is that adoption isn't just a technical journey, but it's a catalyst for a more meaningful business transformation. We're seeing that it's a real opportunity to drive an ecosystem, not just to focus on the technology. And in today's conversation with LSEG, you'll hear about that real-world implementation of FDC3 by one of the largest vendors in our industry. You'll hear what it takes, what's been learned along the way, and what's next. So Yatin, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to start at the obvious place, the beginning. Where did this journey start for LSEG, and what was the catalyst that sparked adopting FDC3?
Thank you. Well, look, I think it might be worth just taking a little step back. LSEG Workspace is already an ecosystem today with hundreds of thousands of users. And we've asked ourselves the difficult questions in terms of one, what do our customers need? And two, how can we be the ones to deliver on it? The key thing for us when speaking with customers is underpinning the foundational of the platform is to be an open ecosystem. Our customers demand more choice. It's not just about navigating through a single platform. They seamlessly want to have that experience of multiple applications in a single interface. And when we look at that, as part of that, how can we deliver on that? And for us, FDC3 is key to this. But it's also a collaboration of teams inside of LSEG. So we work very closely across product, design, and engineering. And look, Aaron next to me can speak a little bit about our exploration on FDC3.
Thanks, Yatin. Yeah, so just building on what Yatin's saying, I think FDC3 for us is, the route to that more open platform, both in terms of user experience, but also from a sort of development engineering perspective. Trying to move from our existing proprietary system to an open standard has all sorts of long-term benefits in terms of scalability, maintainability, all those kind of considerations, as opposed to us continuing to maintain an internal proprietary developed system. So I think that's really where I see the long-term value, partly in the customer experience, that kind of open standard experience, but also from our engineering perspective, providing all those kind of benefits that we get from adopting an open standard.
Yeah, thank you both. And Aaron, when we were prepping for this, you talked about that existing messaging framework that you had in-house, and you said it was a set and forget, right? So it had a lot of complexity to it, but difficult for end users to change over time. When you disrupted that existing framework, what was the big mindset shift needed internally to move from simply linking applications to being able to model intent-driven workflows and to empower users to be able to manage and compose their own experiences? Aaron, I'm going to come back to you for this.
Yeah, I mean, we're actually in an interesting position at LSEG. So whereas in many cases, people will be bringing FDC3 in as a new capability. Oh, sorry, can you hear me better? That's better. So yeah, whereas in many cases, people will be bringing FDC3 in as a new capability, at LSEG, we were in the position of having an existing system which allowed the linking of applications together. We actually had two legacy systems in that we have an older product which had a very powerful but complex linking system in Icon, which was the previous version of our kind of flagship desktop product. That system was extremely powerful but very complex, and kind of down to the level of allowing you to link data fields in one app to data fields in another app. We're almost kind of giving the users an IDE to create their own application. In Workspace, we'd migrated that to a slightly simpler system, more in line with FDC3, but kind of different in some important ways in that it was still built around the idea of linking applications together, as opposed to one of the design goals of FDC3, which is about being able to share context between applications without creating those kind of links. So for us, the starting point was actually we had these existing systems and the existing mindset in place. So the way people internally and externally thought about it was in terms of linking applications. So it's been quite difficult, actually, surprisingly difficult to try to shift that mindset and try and explain to people, especially non-technical people, about how FDC3 is subtly different to that. And what we're doing is not trying to link applications. It's about sharing context via the color channels or via intents, which give you that sort of decoupled interaction between apps.
No, really interesting, and I think a unique perspective with the transition from an existing system. A lot of the firms we worked with didn't have something before, so it was about a new adoption. That being said, it is very interesting shifting from having links or direct integrations to going to a world of composable workflows. And that involves people outside of just product and engineering. You're bringing in design, you're bringing in client feedback. We haven't probably talked enough yet about clients yet, Yatin, but you're bringing that all together, right, to have that thoughtful design. Aaron, I'm going to come back to you, and then we'll bring Yatin back into the conversation. Anyone in this room who's done a technology project knows that there is always a blocker. So what blockers did you experience, and how have you overcome them?
So I think I'd kind of split the whole FDC3 adoption into several strands. One is around rolling out the actual technical capability itself, which, like I said, for us was especially complex because we had this existing platform and estate of applications which were built around the existing system. So the sort of technical complexity of rolling out the capability was actually extremely high. Workspace, I don't know how many are familiar with Workspace, but essentially Workspace is a platform through which we deliver somewhere north of 1,000 different applications. And all of those applications were built around the existing linking system. So strand one is rolling out the actual FDC3 capability in a way that was backwards compatible with the existing system, so that was extremely complex. The second strand was around all of those 1,000 applications needed to be upgraded to work with FDC3 as opposed to the existing system. So again, that was logistically extremely challenging. I'm sure Yatin can talk a bit to that. Because each of those applications, well, not every single one, but all those different applications are delivered across a number of different lines of business. So some of them were sort of delivered from the central platform capability, but the rest of them we had to work and coordinate with all of those different business stakeholders to get that work scheduled and prioritized and get the apps upgraded. And then the third stream then is actually the user migration. So we had an existing user base who were used to the existing system, and as I think you mentioned a little bit earlier, Vickey, because the existing system was fairly complex, we were often in a situation where users, once that linking was set up, they didn't really want to touch it again. Right? They didn't want, because they weren't quite sure what would happen. So trying to educate the users that we're trying to move to something like FDC3 where it's a lot more user-driven, and what we're trying to achieve is to empower the users to curate their own workflows as opposed to just having something that's been configured for them, so sort of slightly personalized, but then they can't touch it. So I think that's the third strand, and that's kind of the journey we're on at the moment, is still trying to affect that change.
Absolutely. I think when you think about an ecosystem, there are two parts to it. One is the producers, which is essentially our engineering team, which is building inside the ecosystem. And then the second one is the consumers. From a producer angle, Aaron touched upon it, over 1,000 apps. You can think about multiple teams which we need to navigate and coordinate. And we're asking multiple teams to do work on this. And as you can imagine, prioritization is a key topic which comes across for all these multiple teams to having to do this work. Some of the core apps which actually sit within our team, so we can coordinate and prioritize some of that work and actually start to show the value, which actually brings people along the journey. From the consumer angle, as we mentioned, we already have linking in place. I think Vickey touched upon it. Everyone's been part of large-scale migrations, and we've just gone through one quite recently with Icon to Workspace. And you know, it's not easy. You have this cliff edge approach where you can actually turn people off one day and they come in on Monday morning and they have to deal with whatever they have to deal with. Or you can take that glide approach where you can target certain users, migrate them slowly. And that's the approach which we're taking. But alongside that, you know, we need to make sure that the interface is user-friendly enough and intuitive enough for people to do it themselves. You know, firms don't have tons and tons of resources to go and visit each customer and explain to them what they need to do. So the interface, the user experience is absolutely critical to this. Aaron mentioned we are on a journey, but I think like in-product tools to help users navigate and explore these new experiences is critical.
Okay, navigating from users to another critical point, which is symbology. You've mentioned when we've been preparing for this that symbology is critical, but especially now that you're coming into the Here Enterprise browser and sitting alongside other third-party apps. So what's your approach to managing for your symbology conversion, whether that's how you ingest and convert other symbology into RICs, or the other way around, how you're broadcasting and maybe adding some extra symbology to a data packet? Aaron, you want to tackle that first?
So yeah, symbology is an interesting one, and obviously it becomes more and more important as we get into these real use cases where we're trying to interoperate with third-party applications. So then we, as you say, we're doing a lot of work with the enterprise browser, which then brings offerings from different vendors together in one place. Internally at LSEG, we generally use RICs as our primary identifier alongside PermID. Obviously, if we're interacting with or interoperating with other applications, they may use different primary identifiers. And it's a bit of an open question because it's not really well defined in terms of FDC3 standards. How do you convert between those different identifiers? So for us, we're taking the approach that if we receive a context object from someone else, then we take on the responsibility of interpreting that identifier and using our internal APIs. We have the ability to look that up and convert it into a RIC and use that internally. I think there's an interesting question for the community about, is there a sort of generalized standard approach that we should be adopting, either by potentially everyone moving to use the same identity scheme? That seems like quite a challenging thing to achieve. But in the meantime, there's some kind of gap where we're going to have to do these conversions, and it just adds that bit of friction to the process, which can be a bit unhelpful. But then in terms of when you're broadcasting, I think one question is there an obligation on apps that they should enrich their objects at the point of broadcast to be a kind of good citizen and ease the burden? Obviously, for us at LSEG, we have the resources and the capacity to do those kind of conversions. But for smaller vendors, possibly they don't have access to a service that can do that. So is there a need for a sort of industry standard supported service to let everyone do that, possibly?
And maybe for some audience participation in the afternoon after lunch, raise of hands. Who thinks it should be the responsibility of the application owner to do symbology or identifier conversion? Okay, no one's raised their hand. Who thinks it should be the community's responsibility? Got a few hands there. So is there someone else in the room who's going to do it?
LSEG could open source RICs and everyone would use RICs. I couldn't believe you said, I don't know why we don't have a single identifier. Because neither you nor Bloomberg will open source your identifiers, right? So that's why we have a million different non-standard identifiers.
So if you're online, we've had a suggestion from the audience that both LSEG and Bloomberg should just open source their own proprietary. Either or, and. I won't put Aaron under pressure to answer that, though. If we shift to, sticking with the data theme, but let's shift gears a little bit. So how we know there are some gaps when it comes to real world use cases for the data types. And what we've seen in some areas, particularly where there's a portfolio ID, that there's been needs to make some internal extensions, shall we say. So Aaron, can you talk about how you're governing those enhancements internally?
Sure. I mean, this is another big part of the migration story. Again, because we're moving from an existing system primarily based around, internally in Workspace, the existing linking system was based around sharing RICs, internally sharing identifiers primarily. And as we're encouraging teams to move to FDC3 and share these much richer set of objects, as we try and model our existing workflows, we often encounter situations where maybe the set of standard objects are not sufficient. So yeah, there's a question of how do we govern that internally? How do we govern whether we accept there is a need to create a internal custom context object? If so, how do we manage that process? And again, we're sort of starting along that journey. How we've done it so far is essentially by creating an internal catalog of schemas where we think we need to define things that aren't in the standard. We manage that through a sort of standard version control process, keeping it fairly simple and lightweight initially. And then really just by engaging with teams just to try and really kind of interrogate and maybe challenge a little bit on some where teams come back and say, oh, we can't use the standard one because we X, Y, and Z. We need these special fields that we have internally. There's kind of a little bit of a challenge there of saying, actually, is that really true? Or can we tweak our internal process a bit such that we could use the standard? So there's a bit of a negotiation, I think.
And that makes a lot of sense to have the flexibility, but stick to the standard wherever possible. If we shift gears and think more about now the business rationale again, and what are the benefits, right? Because again, in lots of conversations, it is a business decision, and there needs to be an ROI involved. So Yatin, thinking about opening up to the ecosystem, what's been the most impactful benefits so far of opening up your workspace applications with FDC3? And what barriers do you see to other firms adopting the standard?
Sure. I touched upon this earlier about having an open ecosystem. FDC3 enables workspace applications to be portable and essentially allows us to be on the desktops of our core users. And that's huge, right? I think I've been building platforms for over 20 years. I think gone are the days of having a single interface constrained by a browser. And users just are expecting access to multiple data points, multiple interfaces in one place. And in essence, what we're doing here is we're simplifying the workflows, saving time, increasing accuracy, and discoverability of new insights. And this enables us to do this. What are the biggest barriers? I think, look, I can talk about LSEG in particular. I think an understanding of what FDC3 is and the benefits. I mean, even a simple presentation about what FDC3 is, it doesn't say what it is on the tin, right? So you need to explain it. And I think one of the core things which we've done is we've learnt that, rather than talk about it, show it in action. And people can actually see the benefits of what we're actually doing. This actually helps with prioritization and also with conversations with our customers. And by the way, we're seeing traction with our customers at the moment. They're asking about interoperability. The Here browser, I've got to put a plug in for the Here browser there. I think it's been great, actually. We've been able to demonstrate the value of FDC3 interoperability browser, and we're having more and more customers come and ask about this. So I think the barrier is having to re-explain in terms of what FDC3 is. And my advice here would be to actually show it in action rather than talk about it.
I think that's excellent advice. And while you're giving advice, what other advice do you have from your own experiences overcoming some of those internal barriers? So if you put yourselves in the shoes of someone who's at a vendor today, they see the logic, but they've got to convince their CEO, the head of design, the head of product, and their chief commercial officer. What would you say to them?
Sure. So one of the key things is obviously you need to get stakeholder buy-in. One thing which we have done at LSEG is to empower our teams. Aaron is part of obviously leads our engineering architecture team, and in his spare time he actually builds up new innovative solutions to demo to the team. And in this particular example, we were able to show the benefits of FDC3, why we're doing it. But in relation to that, you've got to have customers demanding what we're doing. That really helps in terms of driving through what is required. And as I mentioned earlier, I think I'd say in the past 9 months, customer conversations are all about interoperability. And we're on a journey as well, by the way. We're by no means complete. But this journey is showing that there's more traction, more demand for what we're doing, and that really helps in all conversations we're having with internal stakeholders.
Yeah, I've had a few people comment that the number of attendees at this event has only doubled, and we know there's a lot of people online, and there'll be New York in October as well. So that ecosystem, that network effect is absolutely happening, and that'll only help to drive more adoption. We just had a session on AI right before this. So Aaron, I'm not going to ask you to repeat that or opine on the presentation. But there is the potential for AI to change FDC3 and to introduce an alternative way of doing things. Could you comment on whether or not you feel that a desktop agent could be a shift to an intelligent coordinator?
Sure. Firstly, I'd say amazingly we managed to get through 15, 20 minutes without talking about AI, which is quite an achievement. But let's talk about AI. I think, if anyone was here for the previous session, we had an amazing demo showing the power of bringing AI and FDC3 together. I think there's incredible potential there of what could be done. And once you kind of bring that agentic capability into the UI, it opens up all sorts of possibilities. So I think it sort of presents an opportunity, but also a little bit of a challenge in terms of FDC3. I think there's an opportunity because a lot of the stuff we're looking at involves, as I say, sort of bringing that sort of generative UI paradigm to the forefront. So bringing agentic capability, giving agency ability to control the UI. And in order for that to work really well, you need to somehow expose the state of your UI to the agent. So I've been thinking a lot about the fact that potentially there's some way that FDC3 could extend to cover that, to provide a standard way of exposing UI state to agents, to models. So there's an opportunity there. I think there's also a bit of a challenge on a number of fronts. So one is obviously FDC3 is built around interoperable workflows. That's kind of the idea. Whereas with AI, you start to get this possibility that actually it collapses workflows into almost a single application. So is this, long term, is there a need for an interoperability standard, or do we just, you have one agent, one Jarvis that does everything for you? Obviously, maybe you need a standard under the hood, but it'd be less obvious. So yeah, I think it's interesting, but definitely as we move, we obviously had the idea of an agent for quite a long time in FDC3, but as that agent becomes more intelligent, I think definitely the landscape is going to change. On a more sort of technical front, I think it's quite interesting to think about things like MCP. And another idea I've been thinking about is if you think about a sort of desktop agent and a number of apps And the way intents work at the moment, if you think of intents as essentially being like tools that the agent can use, then could we potentially move to more of a paradigm where you think of the apps as being MCP servers that are exposing a set of tools to an agent? So again, in that picture, where does FDC3 fit? I think it becomes slightly unclear, especially given the capability of agents to interpret state. Right, so if the agent can, you can basically give the agent a screenshot of the application, and it can figure out what state is being represented. So, you can imagine there's a bit of a challenge there of like, actually, do we need a standard at all, or can we rely on the agents to just kind of figure it out? So definitely lots to think about.
I think lots to think about in this discussion so far. So where can AI go? Where should identifiers or symbology land? What about extending data types to bring in more workflows across more adjacencies, across financial services and potentially beyond? But Yatin, coming back to you and looking backwards, what was the biggest lesson that you learned along the way?
Sure, for us was to engage stakeholders right early on. Actually, I think maybe a lesson learned is we spoke about what we're doing within our Workspace team, but I think the broader communities, we needed to bring them on board in terms of what we're doing, and we need them now actually, because they need to do work to adapt FDC3. Maybe we could have brought them on the journey much sooner, and maybe we could have accelerated our efforts in terms of where we wanted to be. So I think that's the biggest takeaway from me. But in addition to that, explaining what we're doing to different stakeholders in a simple way. I think don't get bogged down in technical language, because some of the decision makers don't understand that technical language. So yeah, a couple of lessons learned for me looking back.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And we have just enough time for a rapid fire question each. So Aaron, let's close with a few quick thoughts on one piece of advice from a technical standpoint that you would have for a firm that's just starting out.
Technical advice, I think, kind of following on from what Yatin was saying, actually, it's about making sure that everyone really understands the nuance of how to implement FDC3. So one thing we've learned, even talking to developers, so very technical people who you would expect to really understand the detail, I think what happens is often people take that, but they sort of translate it into a mental model that they already understand. So sitting down with development teams as part of the implementation, really kind of trying to work through concrete examples of workflows and how you would implement those with FDC3. Rather than just sort of assuming that because people have read the standard, they kind of get the idea.
I think that's a big assumption. And Yatin, from your perspective, what's one feature you'd love to see added to FDC3?
Interesting, because I was speaking about a feature with Aaron just before this, and he thinks it's already available. So I think I was thinking more something around a capability API of the apps. So for example, when you're thinking about the user experience, when you're inside of this environment, it can suggest your next best action in terms of apps which are available, which you can context share with. Maybe the user doesn't know about some of the apps and capabilities, and somehow using user experience to drive new workflows for those end users. But yeah, Aaron said to me, maybe some of that is already available.
Excellent. Well, that brings us roughly to time. So I hope this has been interesting for everyone to hear about a real case study in FDC3 adoption. Very much about openness, about having customer demand, and about making smart business decisions. At Here, we're committed to continuing to support clients along this journey, to providing a foundational environment for apps to interoperate in, and also to helping to expand the ecosystem with vendors, buy side and sell side, who are all using FDC3. Yatin and Aaron, thank you very much for joining us and for your insightful and very open thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.